Putin shocked us for 100-mile Ukrainian strike traps 6.5 M shells cripples war economy. The battlefield has shifted far from the front lines and deep into the Russian interior, into the networks and supply chains that sustain the Kremlin's war effort. A single deep strike has immobilized roughly 6.5 million artillery shells and revealed the limits of Russia's geographic depth, its logistical infrastructure, and its already strained wartime economy. What once appeared to be Moscow's greatest strength, distance, scale, and the ability to stockpile enormous quantities of ammunition, now risks becoming an economic and logistical liability. Analysts describe a Ukrainian strike reaching deep, hundreds of miles, inside Russian territory and paralyzing millions of shells stored far from the battlefield. This event was not simply a demonstration of long-range capability, it was the exposure of a structural illusion, the notion that Russia's vast geography could indefinitely protect its war-making capacity. The incident highlighted not only gaps in air defense coverage, but the deeper economic fragility that underpins the Kremlin's strategy. From a military economic perspective, the central issue is not firepower alone, but logistics. A state can mobilize hundreds of thousands of troops and produce millions of shells, yet those assets lose strategic value if they cannot move efficiently. Ammunition that cannot reach the front becomes frozen stock, existing on paper but functionally inert. When approximately 6.5 million shells are trapped in storage nodes deep inside Russia, the country's appearance of abundance transforms into a logistical burden. In such moments, the gap between military ambition and logistical reality becomes unmistakable. For decades, Russian planners considered their nation's vast interior a natural buffer. Distance was treated as both shield and asset, dispersing risk and guaranteeing the security of essential infrastructure. Ammunition depots, fuel bases, and industrial zones far from the front were assumed to be untouchable foundations of Russian strength. Ukraine's ability to penetrate this depth directly challenges that assumption. Geography, once considered one of Russia's strongest advantages, now appears porous and costly to defend. The significance of the strike lies less in its physical size and more in the disruption it inflicts on a supply chain the Kremlin has spent more than 2 years trying to stabilize under sanctions. Facilities placed deep in the interior to ensure safety must now be reconsidered. Infrastructure once believed secure must be protected with additional air defenses, dispersal, and hardening measures. What were previously safe assets risk becoming liabilities that draw resources merely to remain operational. The immobilization of millions of shells emphasizes how time becomes the most precious currency in wartime economics. When ammunition cannot move, Russia loses more than weapons. It loses time. Time lost translates into production delays. Delays create shortages at the front. Shortages force emergency reallocations that come at higher cost and lower efficiency. To keep supplies flowing, Moscow must redirect labor, capital, and attention from sectors such as healthcare, civilian infrastructure, and public services. These strains emerge in a context in which Russia already faces structural economic pressure. Sanctions restrict access to technology, financial channels, and critical components. Skilled labor has declined because of mobilization and emigration. Import costs have risen as trade networks adjust to the loss of Western markets. The state depends increasingly on a narrow group of external partners, reducing flexibility and bargaining power. Under these conditions, an event that immobilizes 6.5 million shells magnifies pre-existing weaknesses. The trapped shells represent frozen capital, the product of labor, materials, and investment that can no longer generate military effect. The strike demonstrates how modern asymmetry is often defined by cost rather than size. Ukraine does not attempt to match Russia's artillery production. Instead, it targets vulnerabilities that convert Russia's size into a disadvantage. Relatively inexpensive drones, long-range systems, or sabotage teams can create disruptions that are significantly more expensive for Russia to repair. A single successful operation can paralyze ammunition worth hundreds of millions of dollars, damage transport corridors, and force reconstruction across multiple regions. Each disruption imposes costs that far exceed the resources Ukraine expends to cause them. Distance provides strategic value only when defended in depth. Without robust protection, geography no longer functions as a reliable shield. If a strike can reach hundreds of miles into the interior, the assumption that geography equals safety becomes obsolete. To restore confidence, Russia would need to defend not only its borders and frontline areas, but also key logistic and industrial nodes deep within its territory. Building and maintaining such a network imposes heavy costs on an already burdened budget. This development also erodes the traditional distinction between front and rear. For decades, Russian planning assumed that deep interior regions, industrial zones, fuel reserves, and logistics hubs were naturally secure. Now, many of these facilities must be treated as potential targets. Each rail yard, pipeline junction, or storage depot is a point of vulnerability, requiring additional defenses, dispersal techniques, or hardened infrastructure. The psychological comfort that once surrounded the rear has been replaced by uncertainty, forcing new investment in protection, redundancy, and surveillance. Modern technology accelerates this shift. Cheap unmanned systems, long-range weapons, and shared intelligence allow smaller states to strike well beyond traditional front lines. Capabilities once limited to major powers are now more widely accessible. These tools do not eliminate Russia's advantages in scale, but they complicate them and increase the cost of maintaining them. The Kremlin must reconsider how it positions assets, routes supply chains, and allocates defensive systems within its territory. The immobilized shells illustrate these dynamics in tangible form. Ammunition is not simply metal in crates. It represents an elaborate industrial chain. Mining operations extract raw materials. Metallurgical plants refine them. Factories machine casings and fill them. Transport networks move them. When millions of shells become immobile, this entire chain is disrupted. The ammunition exists physically, but the investment that created it no longer generates operational value. Damage to road and rail networks worsens the problem by creating oversupply in the rear and shortages at the front. When a critical junction or bridge is damaged, stockpiles accumulate where they are not needed and fail to reach units that require them. The result is a bottleneck that forces commanders to reroute deliveries, alter schedules, or await repairs. Repairing these disruptions is costly. Tracks must be relaid, bridges reconstructed, and alternate routes fortified. Additional guards and air defense units must be deployed. New depots may be constructed farther from predictable target areas. All of these actions consume labor and capital that could otherwise support civilian development or long-term economic growth. Instead, policymakers devote increasing attention to crisis management, addressing vulnerabilities revealed by each new strike. Modern warfare increasingly revolves around such invisible indicators of performance. The decisive factors are often not the number of tanks or artillery pieces, but the speed with which ammunition can be replaced, the reliability of fuel delivery, the resilience of communication and transport networks, and the efficiency of infrastructure repairs under pressure. A state may possess extensive stockpiles, but if the lines that feed the front are fragile, its effective strength is far lower than its totals suggest. Russia's recent experience reflects this gap. At the same time, the broader Russian economy operates under sustained pressure. Rising defense spending absorbs a growing share of the national budget. Sanctions restrict technological and financial access. Labor shortages persist. As more resources are directed to the war, fewer remain for sectors that support long-term growth. In this environment, each logistical failure is more than a technical setback. It becomes an additional strain on a system already stretched thin. Ukraine's approach is designed to exploit this strain. By targeting key nodes in Russia's logistics network with relatively inexpensive means, it forces Moscow into a cycle of costly reactions. Air defense grids must be expanded. Transport corridors must be reinforced. Depots must be dispersed or hardened. Command structures must allocate funds for contingency planning, redundancy, and emergency repairs. The Russian state becomes more reactive, responding to disruptions rather than setting the strategic tempo. This dynamic exposes a deeper contradiction at the heart of Russia's war strategy. The Kremlin is attempting to sustain a long industrial-scale conflict while presiding over an economy that is gradually narrowing under sanctions and demographic pressures. Modern war demands a resilient economic base capable of absorbing shocks and regenerating capabilities quickly. When millions of shells become trapped far from the front, questions arise about the true depth of Russia's reserves and the state's ability to mobilize them effectively. The implications extend beyond ammunition. To keep the war running, Moscow has redirected national wealth toward defense at the expense of civilian sectors. Over time, this shift erodes economic resilience, lowers productivity, and shrinks the tax base that funds the state. Inflation, supply shortages, and declining public services become the domestic consequences of external military ambition. The immobilized shells illustrate this trade-off: large investments tied up in assets that cannot be fully used. Russian leaders now face a narrowing set of choices. Scaling back operations risks political backlash and challenges the narrative of control. Continuing at the current pace requires greater sacrifices from the domestic economy. Each new logistical disruption intensifies this tension because it demands additional spending merely to maintain existing levels of capability. The war increasingly becomes a test of economic endurance rather than purely military strength. In this light, the deep strike and the trapped ammunition appear not as isolated events, but as indicators of a broader turning point. Russia's geographic depth no longer guarantees safety. Its industrial scale no longer guarantees uninterrupted supply. Its centralized economic model no longer guarantees resilience under sustained pressure. The logistical failures, immobilized stockpiles, and rising fiscal burdens are interconnected symptoms of a system operating near its limits. Whether the Kremlin can adapt logistics and reinforce interior infrastructure faster than new shocks arrive will shape the future trajectory of its war effort. The effectiveness of Russia's military operations will depend increasingly on its ability to rebuild, protect, and maintain the economic and logistical systems that underpin the conflict.